Many of you here today will already know our next speaker, Nick Cohen. Nick is an author, journalist, and political commentator. Nick is fresh from his London Marathon triumph, and we are particularly grateful to have him here today because he managed to come despite breaking his foot earlier this week. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nick Cohen.
Thanks very much. Even before I broke my foot, I was going to use this opportunity to, if you like, go on from a discussion about combining opposition to the religious far right, and I was going to say the political far right, but I'm going to say political extremism, because it can be a bit too comfortable to say the far right, because everyone's against them. And it was going to be quite tough on myself, because I believe quite strongly you should always take time to sit down and reevaluate your thinking and see if it's rational, whether it's prejudiced, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps challenging some of your preconceptions. That determination has only been strengthened since I emailed the National Secular Society earlier this week to say, my words were almost this: I've broken my foot. The doctor says I shouldn't move. Obviously, I will come if you can't find someone else, but please bear in mind my medical instructions. Now, I'm English and middle class, they're English and middle class. We lie all the time. For instance, if you say to me, how interesting, I know you're bored to tears. If I say to you, hey, we must have coffee sometimes, that means I hate your guts and I never want to see you again. So when I say to the National Secular Society, I'll only come if you can't find someone else, that means no way can you ask me to come to this unless you're total bastards. They're total bastards. So I want to be tough. Here, it strikes me, has been a problem with my thinking over the years and perhaps a problem with yours. When people complained about anti-Semitism, when Jews complained about anti-Semitism, my default response used to be, perhaps your default response, is these are Jews using anti-Semitism as a way of deflecting or prohibiting criticism of Israel. When Muslims complained of Islamophobia, I still do, incidentally, to an extent, object to the word Islamophobia for anti-Muslim bigotry, and again think of the Muslim Brotherhood or Jamaat-e-Islami wanting to get a blasphemy law in, wanting to prevent religious satire, wanting to ensure control over communities, as we've been heard. And the same with anti-Hindu prejudice, and the same with anti-Sikh prejudice, and the same with the often desperate attempts one sees in the conservative press to talk about anti-Christian bigotry. I still do believe that applies in some cases, but I do think now we need to have, or I certainly need to have, a far tougher look at these thoughts. On the far left, anti-Semites now dominate the Labour Party. They certainly dominate its leadership. They dominate the forums where they talk, Twitter, Facebook groups. For instance, if you go on there, I don't know how many secularists have had this experience, if you go on there and start objecting, as one should, to Corbyn's support for the Iranian theocracy, paid support for which he was paid, how he goes on press television again and again and again, even after it's paraded the forced confessions of tortured journalists, and never says a word about women's rights, gay rights in Iran, never talks about the oppression of ethnic and religious minorities. My bet is that sooner or later, probably sooner, you will be accused of being a Zionist or following a Zionist agenda or being in Israel's pay. Equally, on the right now, it's not at the top of the Tory party, but the dominant movement in the right is to use anti-Muslim prejudice. You see it in Hungary, in the Orban government. You see it used by the far right that's come to power in Austria and in Italy, and to an extent in Poland too. One should never, ever, it's British particularism, British exceptionalism to think that the great movements of the world somehow exempt Britain, that we, through something in the water or whatever, are cut off, are an island, we are a moderate, sensible people. I mean, anyone who's lived through the Brexit debate and still holds on to that has not been paying attention. What do people like me, people like you do about this? I'm not for a moment suggesting that we should stop, or I should stop, you obviously do what you want, opposing the control of communities, control of women, the opposition to gay rights one sees in Birmingham, the identity politics that forces people into silos and then says this cleric or that cleric is their spokesman, and anyone who says otherwise is an anti-Semite or a racist or an Islamophobe. But I am saying this, there needs to be, or I think there needs to be, a far stronger recognition of the conspiracy theories that lie both behind left and right and what they mean for liberal and enlightened values. Take the far left first. Anti-Semitism in a peculiar way has almost nothing to do with Jews. In its modern variant, it's always been there, but in its modern variant, it's developed by the Tsarist secret police at the beginning of the 20th century, and Tsarism, then Russia was to our predecessors in the 19th century, Russia was the great reactionary power, the great enemy. And in some ways, Putin is bringing that back into Europe. And what they tried to do, the Russian Empire was confronted with liberalism, it was confronted with demands of democracy, it was confronted with socialism. So it started building up anti-Semitism to say to the peasants, to the credulous, to the right-wing middle class, this is all a conspiracy. All these demands for liberation are conspiracy. Democracy is a sham. Liberalism is a sham behind which lurks the controlling figure of the Jew. You can see, obviously that was used by Nazism. It was used by Stalin a lot in the late 40s, early 50s, when Stalin turned on Russian Jews. He turned on everyone, of course. But it was Stalin and the Communist Party who first said, oh, whoa, no, we're not anti-Semitic. We're not like the Nazis, we're anti-Zionists. That's where the language of anti-Zionism comes from. And again, the effect is the same. It's used today by the dictatorships of the Middle East, everywhere from Hamas to Iran. No. The people causing trouble, the people, just as you on a Labour Party forum now would sooner or later be accused of being a Zionist for criticising Corbyn, again, in dictatorships across the Middle East. Liberalism, feminism is always, they always want to say, the Jews are behind this. In that sense, what do secularists do? You will want to, I'm sure, I hope, will look at, say, Orthodox Jewish schools in Stoke Newington and say it is disgraceful that children are not getting the education the national curriculum presents. You want to fight against that. You will, maybe, I don't know, again, I can't speak for you, want to fight against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. However, if you do not understand what anti-Semitism in the Labour Party is, where it comes from, and what it portends if there is a Labour government in which the far left has a majority and has control, what it portends for people like Southall Black Sisters who want to fight religious oppression, well, you get no support from them. What it portends for freedom of speech. Do you really believe a Labour government would allow freedom of speech when every time bad news is delivered against it, they scream down dissent within their own ranks, and they scream about Zionist plots, Israeli government plots, to undermine the sainted Corbyn. On the right now, And again, I mentioned whole governments are following this. On the right, well, you could say it's just UKIP. You could say it's just Tommy Robinson. But just as once the far left of the Labour Party was once diminished as a fringe, and it's now in power, so again, too easily falling for national secularism, we tend to ignore the fringe. Well, you know, with Brexit was once a fringe idea. A no-deal Brexit was, even in 2016, absolutely inconceivable. Vote Leave made no promises to the public at all, which is one reason why we're in this mess. No one ever did. You know, the phrase Brexit means Brexit is the biggest joke of all, because you don't define what Brexit means. You have the permanent paralysis we're living in. But the one thing Vote Leave said, we do not mean a no-deal Brexit. Now, you know, you cannot become leader of the Tory party without supporting no-deal Brexit. So don't just dismiss the fact that UKIP is now anti-Muslim bigotry is essentially its sole selling point. Look at how these ideas move. Look at what's happened in Hungary, in Italy, in the Czech Republic, in Poland. And again, don't think it can't happen here. And once again, when you look at it, you know, I don't know Southall Black Sisters' experiences, but I do wonder. In fact, I'm pretty certain they have never had offers of support from the New Right in Britain. The New Right in Britain is not concerned with making sure that women from ethnic minority communities enjoy full rights and able to live as autonomous citizens. It is against them per se because of their skin colour, because of their background. And once again, we find, very much like on the left, we find a vast conspiracy theory. George Soros has become, if you like, the modern equivalent of the Nazis' Jewish conspirator, with vast supernatural powers of control beyond really anything any human being can have. And the Soros plot, which not just Orban, but Steve Bannon, Trump to an extent, the new right across the world endorses this. The Soros plot is that Soros, a Jewish financier, so hates Western Christian culture, he is destroying it, committing white genocide by flooding Europe with refugees who are overwhelmingly Muslim refugees. Sometimes there are variances. Sometimes it's just the Jews who are doing this. Sometimes it's the European Union. In the Conservative Party, it was widely believed after a remark by a guy who used to edit me at the Evening Standard, who had briefly worked as Jack Straw's assistant. He wrote a rather clumsy sentence where he said, or it was taken to mean that New Labour, when in power, wanted to allow mass immigration because it would destroy the Tory party in Britain because immigrants didn't vote Tory. So they too believe in a vast plot, in a vast conspiracy theory. And the problem with conspiratorial thinking, same on the right as on the left, the problem is that leaves very little space for the Enlightenment. Because if you truly believe there are these sinister powers, these supernatural powers, these powers beyond anything you and I and the ordinary decent people we hear so much about possess, any tactic is justified to get rid of them. You can see that when Brexit ended in throwing the country into chaos, as it was always going to do. You can see how no one admits that. No, they instantly start attacking the institutions of a free society. So we've had when Gina Miller goes to court to say, well, Parliament surely should decide on Brexit because we're a democracy and it's what we do. And anyway, the whole thing was about taking back control of parliamentary sanctuary. The judges attacked as enemies of the people. We've seen demands from Conservative MPs for universities to have more pro-Brexit lecturers. We've seen civil servants like Ollie Robbins attacked. Because the reason Brexit is going wrong is not because the whole thing as sold, is impossible. We simply cannot have a no-deal Brexit from the European Union without it really hurting. But that is what the public has been sold and was sold. It must be a plot by Remainer civil servants or Remainer BBC. So you imagine either of these movements in power. They do not respect the values of free debate, of independence, and in particularly checks and balances. So that, for instance, there is, to the Labour Party's shame, and I believe this is going to go down on the gravestones of some of them, the Equality Human Rights Commission is having a massive investigation into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And from what I've seen, the results are going to be pretty shocking and pretty humiliating. I can't see the new extremist movements in Britain allowing independent bodies, checks and balances like that, to allow that. Or at the very least, if that is too hysterical maybe, or too over the top, at the very least, I think there's a possibility that they wouldn't. Both sides have got an anti-democratic, illiberal mentality that comes from their conspiracy theory. So what, in short, should secularists do? I am not suggesting for a moment that people stop campaigning against religious tyranny, against the oppression of rights, against the use of religion as a trump card. Say, we can play this card, therefore we can control women's bodies, therefore we can control children's education. Therefore, this card gives me the right to speak for people which I have not earned. Above all, I think that is the main thing. I have not earned it. No one's elected me. I haven't consulted anyone. I just assume, because of God-given authority, that I am a voice and can say that other voices are blasphemers or defamers of the prophet or so on. I'm not suggesting for a moment give that, but I do ask people to think on this. If Tommy Robinson, if Nigel Farage, if Jeremy Corbyn or if Chris Williamson were religious, you would have no problem in understanding them. You would say, well, look, they are all religious militants incite religious hatred. All religious militants say, if you break with Islam, you're doing the work of the Zionists or the Crusaders, or what's the phrase that's thrown at some of my native informants. You're like, people who've gone to work for the colonial authorities. They all do that. They do it all the time. So why, when you see religious hatred used by the far right and the far left, shouldn't you know how to respond to? Second, I think it would be far better, not just morally but tactically, to accept that, to at least think about that, and not say, well, we only do one thing. We don't do lots of things. Liberty doesn't fit neatly into boxes. It's continuous. So, by all means, attack religious fundamentalism. I mean, God knows there aren't enough people doing it. And it's a hard thing to do in the current climate. But don't, while you attack religious extremism, recognize political extremism as being cut from the same cloth, as being deployed by the same kind of small minds. And, oppression doesn't only come in clerical robes. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But that doesn't mean you can be selective about fighting it. Thanks very much.